The grand hall of Silvercrest had never held so many wolves. Lyra could feel their eyes on her like physical weight as the guards dragged her forward, her bare feet scraping against the cold marble floor. She kept her chin up even as her heart hammered against her ribs, even as the silver chains around her wrists burned her skin with each movement. She had learned long ago that showing fear only made predators more eager to strike, and this room was filled with predators wearing the masks of civilization. Alpha Darius sat on the raised dais beside his father, the current pack leader, and he would not look at her. That hurt worse than the chains, worse than the whispers rippling through the crowd like poison. Just 3 days ago he had held her in the darkness of the forest, had traced the small crescent moon mark on her inner wrist with such tenderness, had whispered promises against her skin. Then his father had found out about their secret meetings, had discovered that the future Alpha of Silvercrest was sneaking around with an Omega who worked in the pack kitchens, and everything had shattered like glass. Elder Moira stepped forward from the Council of Ancients, her silver hair gleaming in the torchlight, her smile sharp as a blade. The council had governed all the packs for generations, maintaining order, they claimed, though Lyra had always sensed something rotten beneath their polished words. The old woman's voice rang out across the hall with practiced authority, each word chosen to inflict maximum humiliation. She spoke of pack purity and proper bloodlines, of how Omegas needed to know their place, of how dangerous it was when wolves above their station tried to seduce their betters. Lyra wanted to scream that Darius had pursued her, that she had tried to stay away, but no one would believe an Omega's word against an Alpha heir. The worst part was watching Darius sit there in silence, his jaw clenched, but his mouth firmly shut. He had agreed to this. He had chosen his inheritance over her, had signed the order himself that demanded she be stripped of any mark that might connect her to his bloodline. The small crescent moon on her wrist was not a mating mark. They both knew that. Their wolves had not yet completed any bond, but it was a birthmark she had carried since infancy, one she had always kept hidden under leather cuffs, because it made her different, made her a target for questions she could not answer. She had shown it to Darius in a moment of trust, and now that trust was being weaponized against her. Elder Thomas moved to stand beside Moira, his hands already glowing with the sickly green light of his magic. He was the council's master of bindings and breaks, the one who severed unwanted mate bonds and erased marks that displeased the leadership. Lyra had heard stories of wolves who had been brought before him, who had left changed, diminished, their very essence altered by his power. The green glow made her wolf whimper. Inside her mind, every instinct screaming danger. But there was nowhere to run with guards on every side and silver burning into her skin. She was forced to her knees in the center of the hall, positioned so that every wolf in attendance had a clear view. 2 guards yanked her arms forward, twisting her wrists so that her palms faced upward, exposing the small crescent moon mark that had always been such a mystery. Her mother had died when Lyra was only 3, some sickness that had taken her quickly, and she had left no information about Lyra's father or where the mark came from. The orphanage that raised her had assumed it was nothing important, just an unusual birthmark, and Lyra had never had reason to believe otherwise. If you are finding yourself drawn into this story, please take a moment to like this video and let me know in the comments what you think will happen next. Your support means everything, and helps me continue bringing these stories to life. Elder Thomas began to chant in the old language, words that scraped against Lyra's ears like rusted metal. The green glow intensified, reaching out like fingers toward her exposed wrist. She could feel the foreign magic approaching her skin, could feel her wolf snarling and throwing itself against the barriers of her control. Something felt wrong. Not just the violation of having her mark forcibly removed, but something deeper, something ancient stirring in her blood. The crescent moon on her wrist began to tingle, then burn, then pulse with a heat that had nothing to do with the silver chains. The moment the green magic made contact with her mark, everything exploded. Light erupted from her wrist in a brilliant silver cascade that sent Thomas stumbling backward with a cry of pain, his own spell shattering like it had hit a wall of pure power. The crescent moon was no longer small or simple. It was expanding, spreading up her forearm in intricate patterns of silver that glowed so brightly people had to shield their eyes. Lyra gasped as knowledge flooded her mind. Memories that were not hers but belonged to her blood. Visions of a white palace under a full moon, and a beautiful woman with silver eyes who wore a crown of starlight. The marks spreading across her skin were not random. They were the royal seal of the Lunaris bloodline, the lost dynasty that had ruled all wolf packs before the great betrayal 3 generations past. History said the Lunaris had been corrupt, that they had abused their power, that the council had risen up righteously to overthrow them and establish fair governance. But the memories flooding through Lyra's consciousness told a different story. Showed loyal wolves murdered in their sleep. Showed a desperate queen pressing a baby into a trusted servant's arms and begging her to run. Showed the council's true faces twisted with greed as they slaughtered anyone with royal blood. The entire hall had gone silent, every wolf frozen in shock as they stared at the palm. Unmistakable royal marks now blazing on Lyra's skin. Elder Moira's face had gone white as death, while Elder Thomas was backing away with terror in his eyes. They knew what this meant, knew what they were seeing, and their carefully constructed lies were crumbling in real time. Darius had finally looked at her, was staring with his mouth open, and Lyra could see the exact moment he understood that he had not just rejected some kitchen omega, but the last living heir to the throne, his own ancestors, had helped destroy. Then the howl came. It started as a distant sound, barely audible, but it grew and grew, until it was shaking the very stones of the hall, until wolves were dropping to their knees with their hands over their ears, until the ancient windows were cracking from the sheer power resonating through the air. It was not a normal wolf's howl. It carried something older, something that spoke directly to the most primitive parts of their nature, and demanded submission. Lyra felt her own wolf respond, felt it rise up in her chest, and howl back with a voice she had never known she possessed. A sound of acknowledgement and welcome and coming home. The massive oak doors of the grand hall, doors that took 4 strong wolves to open, exploded inward like they were made of paper. Splinters rained down as a figure stepped through the destruction, and every wolf in the room felt their breath catch. He was massive, easily 7 feet tall in his human form, with long white hair that fell past his shoulders and eyes like molten silver that seemed to glow with their own light. His presence was overwhelming, an alpha power so concentrated it made even the pack leader on the dais whimper involuntarily. He wore ancient armor that looked like it had been forged from moonlight itself, and when he moved, it was with the deadly grace of a predator who had never known defeat. His eyes scanned the room with cold assessment, passing over the cowering council members, dismissing Darius and his father entirely, before locking onto Lyra with an intensity that stole her breath. Recognition flared in those silver depths. Recognition and relief, and something that looked almost like grief. He crossed the hall in long strides, and wolves scrambled to get out of his way, pressing themselves against walls and pillars in their desperation to avoid his path. When he reached Lyra, he dropped to one knee before her, this massive warrior who radiated enough power to level the entire building, and bowed his head in a gesture of absolute reverence. His voice when he spoke was deep and resonant, carrying clearly through the stunned silence. He called her by a name she had never heard before. Lyra Loon Moonwhisper, last daughter of the Lunaris, blood of the first pack, and the way he said it made it sound like a prayer. Then he lifted his head and fixed the entire assembly with a look of such contempt that several wolves actually fled the room. He spoke of oaths sworn centuries ago, of a duty to protect the royal line that transcended death itself, of how he had waited in the ancient places for the day when the true heir would reveal herself. His name was Kale Silverborn, and he was the last of the White Wolves, the elite guardians who had served the Lunaris crown since the beginning of their kind. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see how Lyra reclaims everything that was stolen from her bloodline. Trust me, you will not want to miss what happens next. Kale reached forward with hands that could crush stone, and gently broke the silver chains on Lyra's wrists like they were made of thread. The burns on her skin began to heal immediately, once the metal fell away, silver light from her marks, washing over the damaged flesh and knitting it whole. He helped her to her feet, with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the violence he had shown the doors, steadying her when her legs threatened to give out. Standing this close to him, she could feel the age rolling off him in waves, could sense that he was far, far older than any wolf should be able to survive, preserved by magic and purpose for this exact moment. Elder Moira found her voice, though it shook with poorly concealed fear. She tried to claim authority, tried to say that the council would need to verify these marks, that there were proper procedures, that no one could simply walk into their hall and make demands. Cale turned to look at her, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. He asked in a voice like winter itself whether she truly wanted to continue this charade, whether she really thought he did not know what the council had done to the Lunaris family, whether she had forgotten that he had been there that night and had seen everything. The color drained from Moira's face completely, and several other council members looked like they wanted to sink through the floor. Lyra's mind was reeling, trying to process everything happening around her while simultaneously integrating the rush of ancestral memories still flooding her consciousness. She could see flashes of her grandmother, the last true queen, could feel the echoes of her power and grace. She could see the night of the massacre, could see trusted council members leading soldiers through secret passages, could see her mother, just a teenager then, running through the snow with a baby clutched to her chest. Her mother had been a princess, had given up everything to keep Lyra safe, had died in poverty and obscurity, so that the last spark of the royal line might survive. Darius finally stood from his seat on the dais, and Lyra could see him struggling with what to say. Part of her, the part that had loved him despite knowing better, wanted him to say something meaningful, to apologize, to show even a shred of the wolf who had held her under the stars. Instead, he started talking about alliances, about how perhaps they had been hasty, about how Silvercrest had always been loyal to the true crown. The transparent attempt to salvage his position made something inside her go cold and hard. Cale growled, an actual animalistic sound that made every wolf in the room bare their throat in automatic submission, and told Darius that he had already made his choice when he sat silent while they tried to strip his true mate of her very identity. That word, mate, hung in the air like a thunderclap. Lyra's wolf surged forward, suddenly paying attention in a way it never had with Darius. Despite the attraction between them, she found herself looking at Cale with new awareness, found herself noticing the way his entire being seemed oriented toward her, protective and possessive and patient all at once. The bond between them was not like anything she had felt before. It was older, deeper, written into the fabric of their souls, rather than just the surface attraction that she had mistaken for destiny with Darius. Cale had been made to guard the Lunaris line, and she was Lunaris. And somewhere in that duty, a bond had formed that transcended normal mate connections. But there was complexity in his eyes when he looked at her, layers of emotion she could not fully read. He was seeing her, but also seeing her grandmother, her mother, all the royals he had failed to save. There was guilt there, heavy and old, and a loneliness so profound it made her chest ache. He had spent centuries alone, waiting, probably thinking he would wait forever, that the line had truly ended. Finding her meant his vigil was over, but it also meant confronting all the ways he had not been enough before, all the deaths he had been unable to prevent. Lyra made a decision in that moment. Looking around at the grand hall full of wolves who had watched her humiliation with satisfaction, at the council members who had tried to erase her very existence, at Darius who had chosen comfort over courage, she stepped closer to Kyle, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, and told him she wanted to leave this place. She wanted to see the old palace, wanted to learn what had been stolen from her, wanted to understand what it meant to be Lunaris. But more than that, she wanted to make the council answer for their crimes, wanted to tear down the corrupt system they had built on the graves of her family. Something fierce and proud blazed in Cale's expression, and for the first time since he had entered the hall, he smiled. It transformed his face from intimidating to devastating, and Lyra felt her heart skip, despite everything else happening. He told her that the old palace still stood, hidden by magic in the mountains beyond the northern territories, waiting for royal blood to awaken it once more. He told her that there were others, wolves who had stayed loyal to the Lunaris crown in secret, passing down the truth through generations, who would rally to her banner if she called. He told her that reclaiming her throne would not be easy, that the council had spent decades consolidating power, but that he would stand beside her every step of the way. Elder Moira tried one more time to assert control, declaring that Lyra could not simply leave, that she was still bound by pack law, that the council had jurisdiction over all wolves regardless of bloodline. Cale laughed, and it was not a kind sound. He asked what pack law applied to a sovereign, what jurisdiction the council could claim over the very authority they had stolen their power from. Then his expression went deadly serious, and he told them that he was invoking the old right of sanctuary, that Lyra was under his protection as the last White Wolf guardian, and that any who tried to stop them from leaving would face him in single combat. The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone in that room knew the stories of the White Wolves, knew that they had been the most formidable warriors ever born to their kind, knew that Cale alone had once held a mountain pass against an army of 1,000 for 3 days and nights without falling. No one, not even the most arrogant alpha in the room, was foolish enough to accept that challenge. Elder Thomas actually fled, his robes flapping as he ran from the hall, and several other council members followed. Only Moira held her ground, her face twisted with impotent rage as she watched everything she had built begin to crumble. Cale offered Lyra his arm like they were at some formal court function, rather than standing in the wreckage of a failed execution, and she took it, feeling the solid strength of him steady her shaking legs. They walked toward the broken doors together, and the crowd parted before them like water, wolves pressing themselves back to avoid even the possibility of contact. Lyra kept her head high, even though she could feel tears threatening, kept her spine straight even though she wanted to collapse. The silver marks on her arm continued to glow softly, a constant reminder that she was no longer the Omega who had cowered in the kitchens, but something far more dangerous. As they passed Darius, Lyra finally allowed herself to look at him directly. She could see regret written clearly on his face now, could see him understanding the magnitude of what he had thrown away. But it was too late. Far too late. And she told him so. She told him that he could have stood with her, could have fought the council's demands, could have proven that his love meant more than his title. Instead, he had sat silent while they tried to destroy her, and that was a choice he would have to live with. His wolf was howling inside him. She could see it in his eyes, finally recognizing its true mate now that she was walking away. But recognition without courage meant nothing. They emerged from the grand hall into the cool night air, and Lyra took her first free breath in what felt like forever. The full moon hung overhead, larger and brighter than she had ever seen it, and she swore she could feel it responding to her. Presence, acknowledging her blood. Cale guided her toward the forest edge where the ancient trees grew thick and wild. He told her they would travel through the night to reach the first safe house, a cabin maintained by loyalists who would shelter them while they planned their next moves. He told her she would need training, both in her powers and in the politics of their world, before she could truly challenge the council. What do you think Lyra should do first when she reaches the old palace? Should she focus on gathering allies or on mastering her newfound powers? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading your theories. The journey through the forest was unlike anything Lyra had experienced before. Cale moved through the darkness like he was part of it, never hesitating, never stumbling, following paths that were invisible to her eyes. He had offered to carry her when it became clear that her kitchen soft feet were not prepared for this kind of travel, and she had been too exhausted to refuse. Being held against his chest was overwhelming in ways that had nothing to do with physical attraction. Though there was certainly that. She could feel his heartbeat, slow and steady like ancient mountains, could smell snow and pine and something uniquely him that made her wolf rumble with contentment. He told her stories as they traveled, his deep voice washing over her in the darkness. He spoke of her grandmother, Queen Seraphina Lunaris, who had ruled with wisdom and compassion, who had worked to uplift all wolves regardless of their designation as alpha, beta, or omega. He spoke of reforms she had implemented, of schools she had established, of laws that had protected the vulnerable rather than just the powerful. The council had painted the Lunaris as tyrants, but Kale's memories showed rulers who had genuinely cared for their people, who had seen their crown as a responsibility rather than just privilege. He also spoke of the night everything ended, and his voice went hollow with old pain. He had been away on the Queen's orders, investigating reports of unrest in the southern packs, and he believed now that it had been a deliberate ploy to separate him from the palace. By the time he sensed something wrong and raced back, the massacre was already underway. He had fought through the soldiers, had cut down dozens trying to reach the royal family, but there had been too many, and they had been too prepared. He found the Queen already dead, found most of the court slaughtered, and in the chaos he had failed to protect Lyra's mother as she fled with the infant princess. Lyra listened to the guilt and grief in his voice and understood that this was a wound that had never healed, that had festered for lifetimes while he waited alone. She reached up with one hand to touch his face, drawing his attention down to her, and told him that none of it had been his fault. The council had orchestrated everything, had planned and betrayed and murdered, and he had done everything one wolf could do against impossible odds. More than that, he had survived, had kept faith, had been there when she needed him most. That had to count for something. His eyes searched hers in the moonlight, and she saw vulnerability there that she suspected few had ever witnessed. He told her that he had been asleep in the deep places, preserved by ancient magic, until her blood had called to him, when the seal on her marks had begun to break under Thomas's spell. It had resonated through the old bonds, and woken him from his centuries-long rest. He had felt her fear and pain, had known the air lived, and had come as fast as his old bones could carry him. The smile he gave her was self-deprecating, calling himself old when he looked no more than 30 in human years. But they both knew he had lived through ages. They reached the safe house just before dawn, a sturdy cabin hidden in a hollow that seemed to exist slightly outside normal space. Kyle explained that it was held in a pocket of old magic, that unless you knew exactly where to look and had the right bloodline, you could walk right past it without ever seeing it. An elderly woman opened the door before they could knock, her eyes widening with shock and then filling with tears when she saw the marks blazing on Lyra's arm. She dropped into a curtsy so deep her knees touched the floor, calling Lyra Your Majesty with a trembling voice, and Lyra had to fight the urge to tell her to stop, that she was just a kitchen worker, that this was all too much. But Kale's hand was steady on her back, grounding her, reminding her that she was not just anything anymore. She was Lyra Loon Moonwhisper, last of the Lunaris, and these people had waited generations for her return. The least she could do was not reject their loyalty when it was finally offered. So she thanked the woman, accepted her welcome, and allowed herself to be led into a cabin that was far larger on the inside than the outside. Another trick of the old magic. There were others there, wolves who had kept the faith, who had preserved the true history in secret, and they all looked at her like she was a miracle made flesh. Over the following weeks, Lyra's entire world expanded and transformed. Kyle trained her relentlessly, teaching her to access the power that ran in her blood, showing her how to command rather than just request. The Lunaris line had always been powerful, but their strength came from connection, rather than domination, from the ability to unite rather than conquer. She learned to feel the bonds that connected all wolves, learned to strengthen those bonds or sever them when necessary, learned to speak directly to the wolf spirits that most could only dimly sense. He also taught her to fight, both in human form and as a wolf, and those lessons were brutal. Kale did not believe in holding back, told her that her enemies would not show mercy, so neither could he in training. She earned every bruise and cut, learned to read his movements, learned to use her smaller size as an advantage rather than a weakness. Her wolf form, when she finally mastered the transformation enough to hold it, was nothing like she expected. Instead of the standard gray or brown of common wolves, she was pure silver, her fur seeming to capture and reflect moonlight until she practically glowed. Kale had stood absolutely still the first time he saw her wolf, his expression unreadable. and then he had shifted into his own form for the first time in her presence. He was massive, easily twice the size of any normal wolf, with fur as white as fresh snow, and those same molten silver eyes. Their wolves had circled each other, communicating in ways that went beyond words, acknowledging bonds and duties, and something more personal that neither was quite ready to name. When they shifted back, Kale had maintained careful distance, always proper, always respectful of her position and her autonomy. But the bond between them continued to grow regardless of his caution. Lyra found herself seeking his presence, found comfort in his steady strength, found that she could be vulnerable around him in ways she had never managed with Darius. Where Darius had wanted her soft and pliable, had been attracted to the Omega he could protect and control, Kale seemed to genuinely admire her growing strength. He praised her progress, challenged her to push harder, treated her like an equal partner in planning their eventual confrontation with the council, rather than a figurehead to be managed. The Loyalists brought news from the outside world, reports of how the council was scrambling to control the narrative about what had happened in Silvercrest. They were claiming Lyra's marks were fake, that she was some Omega who had stolen artifacts and used dark magic to impersonate royalty. They had put a price on her head, offered rewards to any pack that could capture and deliver her to the council for justice. Some packs had bought the lies completely, but others were starting to ask questions, starting to wonder why the council was so desperate to silence one Omega if she was truly powerless. Lyra worked with the Loyalists to spread the true story, to share copies of historical documents that had been hidden away, to remind wolves that there had been a time before the council when their kind had been governed differently. They found allies in unexpected places, younger wolves who were tired of the council's rigid hierarchies, Omegas who had suffered under laws that treated them as property, even some alphas who recognized that the current system benefited only a select few at the expense of the many. 6 months after her escape from Silvercrest, Lyra felt ready to see the old palace. Kale had been reluctant, worried that it was too soon, that she needed more training. But she insisted. She needed to stand in the place where her grandmother had ruled, needed to connect with that history in a tangible way. The journey took 3 days through territory that grew increasingly wild and untamed, until they were walking through forests where the trees were so old and massive they blotted out the sky. The magic here was thick enough to taste, ancient and powerful, responding to Lyra's presence with what felt almost like joy. The palace revealed itself gradually, first as a glimmer of white stone through the trees, then as towers that rose impossibly high, then as the full, magnificent structure that took Lyra's breath away. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache, all flowing curves and delicate spires that seemed to defy gravity, built from a material that looked like moonlight captured in solid form. Kale told her it had been grown rather than built, shaped by generations of Lunaris royals working in harmony with the natural magic of this place, and that only those of the bloodline could command it. When Lyra stepped through the main gates, the entire palace lit up. Every window, every tower, every pathway began to glow with soft silver light, and she felt the structure recognize her, welcome her, acknowledge her right to be there. The doors swung open before her without touch, and inside, she found halls that should have been dusty and abandoned after generations, but instead looked like the inhabitants had just stepped out moments before. Everything was preserved perfectly, held in stasis by magic that had been waiting for royal blood to return. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the moment when Lyra finally confronts the council. You will want to see every second of what happens next. Lyra walked through rooms where her grandmother had held court, where her mother had played as a child, and the memories encoded in the very stones of the palace rose up to meet her. She saw visions of the past overlaid on the present, saw the palace in its glory, days filled with wolves who had believed in something better, who had worked toward a world where designation did not determine destiny. She saw her grandmother's last stand, saw her fighting to give her daughter time to escape, even as she knew it was hopeless. The grief of it threatened to overwhelm her, but Kale was there, solid and steady, his hand on her shoulder grounding her in the present. In the throne room, Lyra found her grandmother's crown waiting on the seat of power, untouched by time or tarnish. It was simpler than she expected. A circlet of silver worked to look, like phases of the moon, beautiful in its elegant design rather than ostentatious display. Kale told her that the Lunaris had never believed in gaudy shows of wealth, that their authority came from service rather than symbols. But symbols still mattered, and when Lyra lifted the crown, she felt power surge through her like lightning, felt the palace respond, felt every protective ward and ancient spell recognize her claim. She did not put it on, not yet. She was not ready to truly claim the throne, not until she had dealt with the council, and proven that she could be the ruler her people needed. But she held it, let its weight settle in her hands, and made a silent promise to her grandmother's memory that she would finish what the old queen had started. She would build a world where wolves were valued for who they were, rather than what designation they were born with, where power served the many instead of the few. That night, alone in the royal chambers that had been prepared for her by the palace's own magic, Lyra finally allowed herself to break down. The weight of everything that had happened, everything she had learned, everything she would have to do, came crashing down, and she sobbed into her pillows with the kind of raw grief that came from the soul. She mourned the simple life she would never have, mourned the Omega who had just wanted to be loved for herself, mourned every moment of innocence that had been stolen when those marks blazed to life on her arm. Kale found her like that, drawn by senses that were attuned to her distress through their deepening bond. He should not have been in her private chambers. Propriety demanded he stay away, but neither of them cared about propriety in that moment. He gathered her into his arms and held her while she shattered, offering no platitudes or false comfort, just his presence and his strength. When she finally calmed enough to speak, she told him she was terrified, that she did not know how to be a queen, that she was just a kitchen worker who could barely read until the loyalists had started teaching her. His response was fierce and immediate. He told her that she had survived the council's attempt to erase her, had walked away from a pack that tried to break her, had crossed dangerous territory and learned skills in months that took others years. He told her that she had the heart of a true Lunaris, that she cared about justice and mercy in equal measure, that she had the strength to remake their world into something better. And most importantly, he told her that she would not do any of it alone, that he would stand beside her every step, that his oath was not just to the bloodline but to her specifically. Something shifted between them in that moment, the careful distance they had been maintaining crumbling under the weight of honesty. Lyra looked up at him and saw not just a guardian or a warrior, but a man who had been alone for far too long, who had suffered and sacrificed and never complained, who had put duty above his own needs for centuries. She saw him seeing her the same way, not as a lost princess or a sacred charge, but as a woman who was brave and stubborn and trying her best in an impossible situation. The kiss when it came was inevitable, a meeting of lips that sent sparks racing down Lyra's spine and made her wolf howl with triumph. Kale tried to pull back, tried to say this was not appropriate, that she was his queen and he was her guardian, but Lyra refused to let him retreat. She told him that she was choosing this, choosing him, that she understood the bond between them was complicated, but that did not make it any less real. She told him that she had been with someone who had claimed to want her, but had abandoned her the moment it became difficult, and she would not make that mistake again. She wanted someone who had already proven they would stand in the fire with her. His surrender was sweet, his careful control finally breaking as he kissed her, like she was air, and he had been drowning. They made love that night in the royal chambers, and it was nothing like the fumbling encounters she had shared with Darius. Kale was patient and thorough, learning her body like it was a text he needed to memorize, bringing her pleasure with an intensity that left her shaking. But more than the physical, there was an emotional intimacy that cracked something open in both of them, a recognition that they had found in each other something neither had dared to hope for. Afterward, lying tangled together in silk sheets, Kale told her stories she had never heard. He spoke of the time before he had become a guardian, when he had been just a young wolf from a common family who had shown unusual promise in training. The white wolves had chosen him. had put him through trials that nearly killed him, had reshaped his very essence to make him into the perfect weapon and shield. He had lost his original family in the process, had given up everything. Normal to serve the crown, and he had never regretted it until the night he failed to save them. That guilt had been his companion for centuries. Lyra traced the scars on his chest, marks that had not healed even with his supernatural resilience, because they had been made by magic specifically designed to kill guardians. He had survived the massacre, but barely, had dragged himself to the hidden sanctuaries and used forbidden rituals to put himself into stasis, preserving his life until he might be needed again. He had slept through generations, through the Council's rise to power, through the systematic erasure of everything the Lunaris had built, waiting in darkness for a call that he had half believed would never come. She told him that his waiting was over, that he had fulfilled his oath, that he had saved her when it mattered most. She also told him that she released him from that oath if he wanted, that she would not hold him to bonds made centuries ago to royals long dead. His response was to pull her closer and tell her that his oath had evolved, that it was not duty keeping him at her side now, but choice. He wanted to help her reclaim the throne, wanted to see the world reshaped into something better, wanted to spend whatever time they had together building, rather than just guarding. The months that followed were intense, as they prepared for the inevitable confrontation with the Council. Lyra spent her days training, studying the old laws, meeting with potential allies, and slowly building a coalition of wolves who were ready for change. The Loyalists brought more wolves to the palace, each one vetted carefully, each one adding their skills to the growing movement. They had warriors and scholars, healers and strategists, wolves from every pack and every designation who had suffered under the Council's rule and wanted something different. News reached them that Darius had been pressuring the Council to retract the execution order against Lyra, claiming that Silvercrest had always been loyal to the Lunaris crown and would support her claim. Lyra laughed bitterly when she heard, understanding that he was trying to position himself advantageously now that the political winds were shifting. Cale asked if she wanted him to send a message to Darius, his tone making it clear what kind of message he had in mind. But Lyra told him to let it go. Darius had made his choices, and he would have to live with the consequences, but he was no longer important, enough to waste energy on. What surprised her was when messengers arrived from other packs, alphas who had not been part of the original conspiracy, and who were genuinely horrified to learn the truth about the massacre. Some offered support cautiously, wanting to see proof of her claims before committing fully. Others pledged themselves immediately, so disgusted by the Council's actions that they were ready to fight. Each alliance was carefully negotiated, each agreement documented in the old ways, until Lyra had a network of support that spanned the continent. The Council tried multiple times to attack the palace, sending assassins and strike teams, but the ancient wards held strong, and Kyle was a force of nature in defending their position. He fought with a skill that seemed impossible, like he was always 3 moves ahead of his opponents, his white fur streaked with the blood of those foolish enough to challenge him. Lyra fought beside him in several of these battles, her silver, wolf form moving in coordination with his white, and together they were devastating. After each battle, they would return to the palace and to each other, finding comfort and renewal in their bond. Cale was an attentive mate, always making sure Lyra's needs were met before his own, and she worked to show him that he was valued for more than just his protective abilities. Their relationship deepened into something that sustained them both through the difficult work of revolution, a partnership, built on respect and trust as much as passion. A year after Lyra's marks had first blazed to life in Silvercrest's Grand Hall, she decided it was time. They had enough support, enough strength, enough legitimacy that the Council could no longer simply dismiss her as a pretender. She sent out a formal challenge, invoking laws so old that most had forgotten they existed, demanding that the Council answer for their crimes before a gathering of all packs. The challenge could not be refused without the Council losing face completely, and after days of deliberation, they accepted. The meeting was held at the ancient gathering grounds, neutral territory that had been used for interpack councils since the beginning of their kind. Thousands of wolves attended, packing the stone amphitheater that had been carved into the mountainside generations ago. Lyra arrived with Kale at her side and her loyalists at her back, wearing a gown of silver that seemed to capture starlight and her grandmother's crown on her head. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral, gasps and whispers spreading like wildfire as they saw the marks blazing on her arm, saw the palace's crown recognizing her claim, saw the legendary White Wolf standing as her guardian. The council members sat in their traditional seats of power, but they looked diminished somehow, their authority undermined by the simple fact of Lyra's existence. Elder Moira tried to speak first, tried to control the narrative, but Lyra's voice rang out clear and commanding, using techniques Kale had taught her to project her words so that every wolf in attendance could hear clearly. She spoke of the massacre, of the lies, of the corruption that had poisoned their society for generations. She presented evidence, documents that the Loyalists had preserved, testimony from wolves who had witnessed the council's crimes. Elder Thomas tried to deny everything, but his voice shook, and his scent betrayed his fear. Other council members attempted various defenses, claiming they had been protecting wolfkind from Lunara's tyranny, that the old royals had been leading them to ruin. Lyra countered each argument with facts, with specifics, with the names of innocents who had been murdered for nothing more than their bloodline. She spoke of the laws her grandmother had implemented, the schools and hospitals, the protections for omegas and the weak, all things the council had systematically dismantled after seizing power. The gathered wolves began to murmur, the sound building like a wave, and Lyra could sense the tide turning. These were wolves who had lived under the council's rule, who had experienced firsthand how the system ground down anyone who did not serve the interests of the powerful few. They were ready for something different, ready to believe that another way was possible. When Lyra called for a vote of no confidence in the council, the response was overwhelming. Thousands of voices raised in agreement, the sound echoing off the mountains. The council had lost, and they knew it. Some tried to flee, but loyalist warriors were waiting at every exit. Others attempted last desperate attacks, pulling concealed weapons or calling on forbidden magic. But Kale moved like lightning, protecting Lyra while also subduing the threats with minimal bloodshed. When the chaos finally settled, the council members were restrained and kneeling before the amphitheater, their power stripped away, facing judgment for the first time in their lives. Lyra could have had them executed. Many in the crowd were calling for blood, for vengeance for generations of suffering. Part of her wanted it too, wanted to make them pay with their lives for everything they had taken from her family. But she thought of her grandmother, of the queen who had ruled with wisdom and mercy, and she made a different choice. She stripped the council of their positions and their authority, banished them to the far territories where they would live out their days in obscurity, and declared that their families would not be punished for their crimes. She would break the cycle of vengeance, would show that the Lunaris crown stood for justice rather than just retribution. The crowd's response was mixed, some disappointed by her mercy, but many more were impressed by her restraint. This was a ruler who could have taken the easy path of violence, but chose the harder road of building something better. When Lyra formally claimed the throne, before the assembly, thousands of wolves dropped to one knee in acknowledgement, their voices raised in a traditional oath of loyalty that had not been spoken in 3 generations. She was no longer just a kitchen omega or a lost princess, but Queen Lyraloon Lunaris, first of her name, and she felt the weight of that responsibility settle on her shoulders like a physical thing. The work that followed was enormous and exhausting and often frustrating. Lyra worked with councils of alphas, betas, and, for the first time in history, omegas to reshape their laws and society. She reinstated the protections her grandmother had fought for, expanded them, created new frameworks that valued contribution over designation. She established schools that were open to all wolves regardless of birth, created courts where omegas could bring grievances without fear, and systematically dismantled the structures that had kept so many in poverty and powerlessness. Not everyone was happy with the changes. There were alphas who missed the old system where their strength gave them unchecked authority, who resisted every reform and fought to maintain their privileges. Lyra faced opposition and sabotage, assassination attempts, and political maneuvering, but she persevered with Kyle's steady support. He had taken the formal title of royal consort, though in practice he was so much more, her partner in every sense, the one who helped her navigate the complexities of ruling while staying true to her principles. Their mating was formalized in a ceremony that brought wolves from every pack, a celebration that lasted 3 days and 3 nights under the full moon. Lyra wore her grandmother's crown and a gown that seemed to be woven from moonbeams themselves, while Kale wore the ancient armor of the white wolves, polished until it gleamed. When they spoke their vows before the gathered masses, there was not a dry eye in the crowd, the romance of their story having spread far and wide. The Kitchen Omega who became a queen, and the ancient guardian who had waited centuries to find his true mate. 5 years into her reign, Lyra stood on the balcony of the palace, looking out over the city that had grown up around the ancient seat of power. The marketplace below was bustling with wolves of every designation working and trading together. Children of all backgrounds playing in the streets without the fear that had marked her own childhood. Schools and hospitals dotted the landscape, monuments to the future she was building. It was not perfect. There was still resistance and inequality and 1,000 problems to solve. But it was better, genuinely better than it had been. Kale joined her on the balcony, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. He told her she had done it, had fulfilled her grandmother's vision, and then surpassed it, had created something new that honored the past while building toward a better future. Lyra leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, and thought about how far she had come from that terrified Omega kneeling in Silvercrest's grand hall. She thought about Darius sometimes, wondering what had become of him. Reports said he had left Silvercrest, unable to bear being in the place where he had made such a catastrophic mistake, and was wandering between packs, never staying anywhere long. His wolf had never accepted another mate, still mourning the bond he had rejected, and Lyra felt a distant pity for him. He had chosen comfort over courage, and would live with that choice forever, while she had chosen the harder path and found something infinitely more valuable. Her hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, where new life was just beginning to make itself known. She had not told Kyle yet. Wanted to wait until she was sure, but she could feel it. Could sense the tiny spark of new existence that carried both their bloodlines. A child who would be born to peace rather than war, who would grow up knowing love and security, rather than fear and hiding. A child who would carry forward the Lunaris legacy into a future that was finally bright. When she told Kale later that night, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He dropped to his knees before her, pressing his forehead against her still flat stomach, and she felt dampness on her skin that might have been tears from a warrior who rarely showed such emotion. He whispered promises to their unborn child, vows to protect and guide and love, and Lyra ran her fingers through his white hair, feeling more content than she had ever imagined possible. The years continued to pass, bringing challenges and triumphs in equal measure. Lyra proved to be a remarkable queen. Her early experiences as an Omega, giving her insight into the struggles of the powerless that no Alpha-raised ruler could match. She was fierce in defending the vulnerable, uncompromising in her pursuit of justice, but also capable of the mercy and forgiveness that true strength allowed. Under her reign, wolf society transformed, becoming something that would have made her grandmother proud. Kale remained her constant companion and partner, his ancient wisdom balanced by his willingness to learn and adapt. He trained new guardians, passing on the traditions of the White Wolves to a new generation, ensuring that the royal line would never again be left unprotected. But he also learned to be more than just a warrior, becoming a father who taught their children with patience and love, a consort who supported his queen while also challenging her when necessary, a mate who never let the demands of ruling diminish the intimacy they shared. Their children grew strong and wise, raised with an understanding of both their royal heritage and the common struggles of their people. Lyra made sure they spent time in every level of society, working in kitchens and markets and schools, learning that service was the true measure of leadership. They would be better rulers for it, and the dynasty she was building would be founded on compassion rather than conquest. Sometimes, On quiet nights when the palace was still and the moonlight streamed through their windows, Cale would hold Lyra close and tell her that his long vigil had been worth every moment of loneliness and pain. Because it had brought him to her, she would kiss him and tell him that being stripped of her mark before that court had been the best thing that ever happened to her, because it had revealed her true self and brought her home to where she belonged. The crescent moon mark that had started everything still graced her wrist, now expanded into the full royal seal that proclaimed her identity to anyone who looked. But Lyra had added something to it, working with the palace's magic to incorporate Cale's mark as well, the symbol of the white wolves intertwined with her own in a permanent declaration of their bond. They were stronger together than either could be apart, guardian and queen, warrior and ruler, mates in every sense that mattered. And if sometimes, in the deepest part of night, Lyra woke from dreams of that terrifying moment in Silvercrest's grand hall, Cale was always there to hold her until the fear passed. He would remind her that she was safe now, that she was powerful now, that she had taken the worst moment of her life and transformed it into the catalyst for saving their entire society. The council had tried to strip her mark and erase her existence, but instead they had awakened a queen. The white wolf had howled her name, and the world had changed forever. If this story moved you, please like this video and share it with others who love tales of redemption and transformation. Your support helps me create more stories like this, and I read every single comment. Thank you for being part of this journey, and until next time, may you all find the courage to rise when the world tries to strip you of who you are.